June 4th, 1942, at 10:24 in the morning, over the Pacific Ocean, 240 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll, Lieutenant Commander W.D.E. McClusky peered down from 14,000 feet and witnessed something that defied all expectation. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were steaming in a perfect diamond formation directly beneath him. Their flight decks teemed with armed aircraft, fuel lines snaked across their surfaces, and ordnance carts were positioned beside bombers awaiting launch. Every single plane was being prepped for immediate deployment. The carriers were in their most exposed state imaginable. This was entirely unforeseen. McClusky had spent the preceding 2 hours navigating a seemingly endless expanse of water, his fuel gauges inching towards empty, with 32 dive bombers trailing him towards what felt like inevitable failure. The Japanese fleet was nowhere near the location predicted by intelligence reports. His squadrons, dispatched from the Enterprise and Hornet, had become separated. Torpedo Squadron 8 had already been utterly annihilated, every single aircraft shot down, with only one man surviving. The American offensive was disintegrating. However, a decision made by McClusky 30 minutes prior was about to fundamentally alter the trajectory of the Pacific War. Upon reaching the anticipated interception point and finding only empty ocean, he did not turn back. Instead, he observed a solitary Japanese destroyer speeding northeast at full velocity. This destroyer, the Arashi, had been engaged in depth charging the submarine Nautilus and was now rejoining the main fleet. McClusky made an instinctive leap. He followed the destroyer's wake. Now, as he tilted over into his dive, McClusky was poised to deliver a blow that would shatter Japanese naval dominance within 5 minutes of ferocious combat. The Japanese had absolutely no inkling that American dive bombers were above them. They possessed no radar capabilities. Their combat air patrol of Zero fighters was positioned at sea level, having just completed the destruction of American torpedo bombers. The airspace above the carriers was completely unprotected. What transpired in the ensuing 5 minutes would later be described by Admiral Chester Nimitz as the pivotal moment that determined the destiny of the Pacific Fleet and the forces at Midway. It was precisely 10:24 in the morning when Lieutenant Commander McClusky initiated a 70-degree dive in his SBD Dauntless. 31 additional dive bombers followed him down. The Japanese lookouts' warnings were issued mere seconds too late. To comprehend the profound significance of these 5 minutes, one must understand Japan's perception of itself and its accomplishments in the 6 months since the attack on Pearl Harbor. In early 1942, the Japanese Empire considered itself utterly invincible. The prevailing statistics seem to corroborate this assertion. Since December 7, 1941, Japanese forces had subjugated an area exceeding the size of Europe. They had seized Hong Kong in 18 days, Manila in 26 days, and Singapore in 70 days. They had expelled the British from Malaya, the Dutch from Indonesia, and the Americans from the Philippines. The Kido Butai, Japan's carrier strike force, had never known defeat. It had sunk 5 battleships at Pearl Harbor, conducted a raid on Darwin, Australia, and driven the British Eastern Fleet from the Indian Ocean, sinking the carrier Hermes and 2 cruisers in the process. Wherever Japanese carriers operated, they brought unmitigated destruction. Their pilots were the most experienced globally, veterans of combat in China since 1937. Their Mitsubishi Zero fighters outperformed every Allied fighter in the Pacific theater. Their torpedo bombers and dive bombers had proven devastatingly effective against every conceivable target. Japanese naval doctrine rigorously emphasized an offensive spirit, the absolute supremacy of attack, and the inevitability of victory derived from superior training and fighting spirit. The concept of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, was intended to overcome any material disadvantage. Japanese officers firmly believed their forces were inherently superior to the Americans, possessing better training, greater experience, and a more profound dedication, willing to lay down their lives for the emperor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had meticulously designed the Midway operation to complete what Pearl Harbor had initiated. The plan was remarkable for its audacious scope. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands was intended to draw American attention northward. Subsequently, the main fleet, the most formidable naval force Japan had ever assembled, would strike Midway, thereby luring the American carriers into a decisive engagement. The Japanese intended to overwhelm them with sheer force. The numerical superiority appeared overwhelming. Yamamoto had marshaled over 200 ships for the Midway operation. 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, 46 destroyers, and 15 submarines. The carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carried a combined total of 248 aircraft, crewed by the world's most experienced naval aviators. The battleship Yamato, the flagship of the combined fleet, displaced 72,000 tons and was armed with 9 18-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever constructed. In opposition to this formidable armada, the Americans could deploy 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. The carrier Yorktown, having sustained damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea, should have required 3 months for repairs. However, mechanics at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard had effected a temporary fix in a mere 3 days, deeming her seaworthy for one more engagement. The American force was outnumbered in virtually every category, with one crucial exception. They possessed knowledge of the impending Japanese attack. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had successfully deciphered the Japanese naval code. They were aware that Midway was the target, that the date of the attack was June 4th, and they knew the composition of the Japanese force and their projected approach route. Admiral Nimitz had strategically positioned his carriers northeast of Midway, concealed and awaiting the enemy. Yet, possessing foreknowledge of the adversary's approach did not guarantee victory. The American assaults on the morning of June 4th had proven disastrous. Marine fighters launched from Midway were decimated by Zeros. Army B-17 bombers, attacking from high altitude, failed to score any hits. Marine dive bombers pressing their attacks were shot down in flames. 5 Dauntlesses lost. Torpedo bombers from all 3 American carriers attacked independently, lacking fighter escorts and any semblance of coordinated effort. Torpedo Squadron 8, launched from the Hornet, suffered the loss of all 15 planes. Only Ensign George Gay survived, adrift in the Pacific, witnessing the furious battle unfold around him. Of the 41 American torpedo bombers that engaged the Japanese carriers, only 6 managed to return to their ships. Not a single torpedo hit was achieved. The attacks appeared suicidal and utterly futile. Japanese Zero fighters descended from above, their 20mm cannons tearing apart the slow, obsolescent TBD Devastators. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black, menacing bursts. American torpedoes, plagued by defects, either ran beneath their targets or failed to detonate. On the bridge of the carrier Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida observed the American assaults with a mixture of contempt and grudging respect. Fuchida had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and commanded the air group that devastated Battleship Row. He possessed an understanding of combat aviation arguably unmatched by any living man. The bravery of the American torpedo bomber crews impressed him deeply, but their attacks were, in his view, ineffectual. Not a single carrier had been damaged. The Americans were squandering their aircraft and crews to no avail. What Fuchida failed to recognize was that those seemingly suicidal torpedo attacks had achieved a critical objective. They had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. Dozens of Zero fighters swarmed low over the water, finishing off the last of the American torpedo bombers. Every Japanese fighter was occupied at low altitude, their pilots fixated on the immediate threat. No one was surveying the sky above. At 10:20 a.m. on the Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo issued the command to launch the counterstrike against the American carriers. Japanese reconnaissance planes had finally pinpointed the American fleet. Nagumo intended to obliterate them. On the Akagi's flight deck, 36 aircraft were positioned for launch, their engines warming, dive bombers and torpedo bombers alike, all armed and fueled, prepared to devastate the American carriers. On the Kaga, 30 planes awaited. On the Soryu, another 21. The total Japanese counterstrike force numbered 87 aircraft, sufficient to sink every American carrier. Admiral Nagumo was supremely confident. His carriers had just repelled massive assaults. His pilots had shot down dozens of American planes. Now, it was their turn to strike back. The massive carriers began to turn into the wind. Within 5 minutes, all planes would be airborne. The destruction of the American carrier force was imminent. Then, the dive bombers arrived. Lieutenant Commander McClusky's radio transmission was starkly simple. Attack. He rolled into his dive at 10:24 in the morning. Trailing him, 31 more dauntless dive bombers pitched over. They plummeted from 14,000 feet at 260 miles per hour, descending at severe 70-degree angles. The Japanese had no time to react. The anti-aircraft guns that had proved so devastating against the low-flying torpedo bombers were incapable of elevating quickly enough to track the dive bombers. The Zero fighters were miles away and thousands of feet too low. The Japanese carriers, having just turned into the wind to facilitate launch operations, were immobile. They presented perfect targets. At 2,500 feet, the pilots released their ordnance. 500-pound armor-piercing bombs with delayed fuses designed to penetrate a ship's deck before detonating. The bombs fell for 4 agonizing seconds before impact. Those 4 seconds would ultimately decide the war. The first bomb struck the Kaga at 10:25 in the morning, impacting just aft of the island superstructure. The resulting explosion detonated aviation fuel and armed bombs that were arrayed on the flight deck. A second bomb struck near the forward elevator. A third hit the port side. A fourth demolished the bridge, killing Captain Jaku Okada and most of the senior officers. Within 60 seconds, the Kaga was transformed from a formidable warship into a scene of devastation. Simultaneously, 3 aircraft from Lieutenant Richard Best's section dove upon the Akagi. The formation had become somewhat disoriented. Nearly all the dive bombers had attacked the Kaga. Best skillfully pulled his 2 wingmen out of their dives and directed them toward the second carrier. His bomb struck the Akagi precisely amidships, penetrating the flight deck and exploding within the hangar deck. The concussive force detonated torpedoes and bombs stored there. Subsequent explosions ripped through the vessel. Commander Fuchida, standing on the Akagi's bridge, heard the terrifying scream of the dive bombers mere seconds before impact. He looked up to witness 3 black aircraft plummeting directly toward his ship. A chilling silence descended upon the vessel for an instant. Then, the first bomb struck. The explosion lifted him bodily off his feet. Smoke and fire erupted from the hangar deck. He watched in abject horror as the Kaga and Soryu also burst into flames. 3 carriers ablaze concurrently. The scene, in his own words, was horrible to behold. The third carrier, the Soryu, was targeted by dive bombers from the Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie led 17 planes in a flawlessly executed attack. 3 bombs struck the Soryu in rapid succession. The first impacted near the forward elevator, the second amidships, and the third aft. Aviation fuel ignited. Bombs and torpedoes detonated. Within minutes, the Soryu was a blazing wreck, its crew desperately abandoning ship. The attack lasted a mere 5 minutes. When it concluded, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were mortally wounded. The Akagi, flagship of the carrier striking force, burned uncontrollably. The Kaga, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and every significant Japanese operation, was consumed by a series of catastrophic explosions. The Soryu, the smallest of the fleet carriers, was engulfed in flames. Over 240 aircraft were destroyed, either incinerated on the flight decks or trapped within the hangar decks below. More than 700 highly trained pilots and aircrew were either dead or would perish in the infernos. The statistics pertaining to the losses incurred were simply staggering. These 3 carriers represented 2/3 of Japan's entire fleet carrier strength. They had participated in every major Japanese naval engagement since Pearl Harbor. The Akagi displaced 36,000 tons and could carry 91 aircraft. The Kaga displaced 38,000 tons and carried 90 aircraft. The Soryu displaced 18,000 tons and carried 71 aircraft. Collectively, they constituted the very core of Japanese naval air power. The pilots and aircrew lost in those 5 minutes were irreplaceable. Japan had invested years in training these men. Their combat experience extended back to the Sino-Japanese War in 1937. The torpedo bomber pilots possessed the skill to deliver their ordnance within feet of their intended targets. The dive bomber pilots could accurately strike moving ships from altitudes of 12,000 feet. The fighter pilots had proven devastatingly effective against Allied aircraft over China, Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and Sumatra. This was not merely the destruction of equipment, it represented the incineration of institutional knowledge, accumulated skill, and irreplaceable experience. What exacerbated the disaster was its timing. Had the American attack commenced 10 minutes earlier, a significant number of Japanese aircraft would still have been housed within the hangar decks, offering a degree of protection. Had the attack occurred 10 minutes later, the majority of aircraft would have been launched, and the carrier's decks would have been relatively clear. However, the American dive bombers arrived at the most catastrophic possible juncture. Every carrier had its deck packed with fully fueled and armed aircraft. The flight decks had effectively transformed into airborne bomb magazines. Admiral Nagumo, visibly shaken by the explosions, attempted to maintain command from the Akagi's bridge, but the fires were spreading with alarming rapidity. Smoke filled the bridge. At 10:46 in the morning, he abandoned ship, descending a rope to escape the raging inferno. His staff followed suit. They transferred to the light cruiser, Nagara. From this vantage point, Nagumo could only observe his once mighty striking force burning. Aboard the Akagi, damage control parties fought with desperate intensity. Captain Tairo Aoki remained on the bridge, attempting to regain control of his vessel, but the fires proved insurmountable. Explosions rocked the carrier as aviation fuel and ordnance detonated. The hangar deck became an inferno. Men trapped below decks perished in the flames or leaped into the sea. The air officer turned to Fuchida and stated that they could not remain on the bridge much longer. Fuchida, already nursing injuries from an appendectomy performed prior to the battle, could only watch as the carrier that had spearheaded the attack on Pearl Harbor met its demise. 267 men perished aboard the Akagi. The Kaga's fate was similarly grim. The multiple bomb hits had initiated fires that raged out of control. The carrier's damage control systems had been engineered for single impacts, not for multiple simultaneous explosions. Water mains ruptured, power failed, communication between decks was severed. Men fought the fires with no water, no power, and no coordination. The ship's list increased dramatically as water flooded the lower compartments. By afternoon, the order was given to abandon ship. 81 men died aboard the Kaga. The Soryu suffered the swiftest destruction. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto resolutely refused to abandon his vessel. His executive officer and others implored him to leave the burning carrier. He refused, determined to go down with his ship. The Soryu's hull was relatively thin compared to the larger carriers. The fires burned through bulkheads with alarming speed. The ship developed a severe list. At 7:13 p.m. on June 4th, the Soryu rolled over and sank, taking Captain Yanagimoto and 71 crewmen with her. However, one Japanese carrier remained. The Hiryu had been positioned several miles north of the other three carriers during the American attack. She miraculously escaped the devastation. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the Hiryu, immediately initiated preparations for a counterstrike. At 10:50 a.m., while the other three carriers were engulfed in flames, the Hiryu launched 18 dive bombers, escorted by 6 Zeros. At 1:30 p.m., these aircraft located and attacked the Yorktown, scoring 3 bomb hits that set her ablaze and disabled her boilers. The Hiryu launched a second strike at 2:30 p.m. 18 torpedo bombers, escorted by 6 Zeros, located the Yorktown at 2:45 p.m. and delivered 2 torpedo hits. The damage inflicted was catastrophic. The Yorktown developed a severe list. At 3 p.m., Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship. The carrier, which had been hastily repaired in 72 hours and had contributed dive bombers to the strike that crippled 3 Japanese carriers, was now dead in the water. But American retribution was swift. Scout planes from the Yorktown located the Hiryu. At 5 p.m., dive bombers from the Enterprise commenced their assault. 24 dauntless bombers dove upon the last remaining Japanese carrier. 4 bombs struck the Hiryu, 2 near the forward elevator and 2 amidships. The bombs ignited fires that spread with alarming rapidity. Aviation fuel ignited. The hangar deck became a raging inferno. By 6:30 p.m., the Hiryu was burning uncontrollably, her flight deck a twisted wreckage of molten metal. Admiral Yamaguchi refused to abandon his flagship. He and Captain Tomosaku Kaku remained aboard the burning carrier, preferring death to the dishonor of surviving defeat. At 2:30 a.m. on June 5th, the Hiryu was scuttled by torpedoes fired from Japanese destroyers. Yamaguchi and Kaku went down with their ship, accompanied by 392 officers and men. The sheer magnitude of the Japanese defeat was almost incomprehensible. In a single day of battle, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers. All 4, veterans of Pearl Harbor, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone. Along with them, vanished 248 aircraft and approximately 3,000 men, including many of the Imperial Navy's most experienced pilots and aircrew. The striking force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months had been utterly annihilated. The psychological impact was shattering. Japanese naval officers had genuinely believed that their rigorous training, extensive experience, and indomitable fighting spirit rendered them invincible. They had conquered half the Pacific in 6 months. They had never suffered defeat in a major fleet engagement. And now, within a single morning, the very core of their carrier force had been destroyed by a numerically inferior American fleet. Commander Fuchida, recovering from his fractured ankles aboard the destroyer that rescued him from the Akagi, understood the implications immediately. Japan had lost the war, not merely the battle, but the entire war. The crucial margin of naval air superiority that had facilitated Japan's conquests had evaporated. The seasoned pilots, who were unreplaceable, were deceased. The carriers, requiring years to construct, now lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Japan would never recover from this singular day of devastating losses. The contrast with American losses was stark. The United States lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, which was already damaged and arguably should not have been in the battle. The destroyer Haman was sunk by a Japanese submarine while engaged in salvage operations on the Yorktown. Total American aircraft losses amounted to 147 planes. Total personnel losses were 307 men. The exchange ratio was catastrophic for Japan. 4 carriers for 1, 248 aircraft for 147, and approximately 3,000 men for 307. The fundamental difference lay in industrial capacity. The United States possessed the capability to replace its losses. Japan did not. The Yorktown was one of 7 American carriers in commission. 2 more, the Essex and Independence, would be commissioned before the end of 1942. By the close of 1943, the United States would commission 13 fleet carriers and 9 light carriers. By the war's end, the United States Navy would operate over 100 carriers of all types, encompassing fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers. Japan could not possibly match this production output. Japanese shipyards, under ideal conditions, could construct perhaps 1 carrier per year. Their industrial base was too limited. Resources were constrained. Skilled labor was insufficient. Japan had commenced the war with 6 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers. Following the Battle of Midway, 4 of these fleet carriers were lost. The 2 fleet carriers damaged at the Coral Sea, Shokaku and Zuikaku, would not return to active service for months. Japan's carrier force was effectively crippled. The losses of pilots were even more devastating. Japanese naval aviation training required years to produce combat-ready aviators. The training standards were exceptionally high, resulting in a severe washout rate. Japan possessed perhaps 1,500 highly trained carrier pilots at the war's outset. After Midway, approximately 1,000 remained, and the training pipeline was utterly incapable of generating replacements at the necessary pace. By 1944, Japanese carrier air groups would consist of minimally trained pilots flying obsolete aircraft against American pilots with hundreds of hours of flight experience in the most advanced aircraft available globally. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding from the battleship Yamato hundreds of miles distant, received the news of the disaster with utter disbelief. He had assembled over 100 ships for the Midway operation, representing the most formidable fleet Japan had ever dispatched into battle. His grand strategy to obliterate the American carrier fleet had been thwarted. Instead, his own formidable assembly of carriers had been decimated. At precisely 2:55 in the morning on the 5th day of June, Yamamoto transmitted the directive to cease the Midway endeavor and initiate a retreat. The invasion armada turned its prow homeward. This withdrawal was a profound humiliation. The contingent designated to seize Midway never came within striking distance. The formidable battleships intended to bombard the island into submission never unleashed a single projectile. The submarines tasked with intercepting the American carriers found themselves in unfavorable positions. The feint attack launched against the Aleutian Islands yielded no significant advantage, save for the temporary occupation of 2 desolate landmasses that Japan would relinquish a mere year later. American forces relentlessly pursued the retreating Japanese armada. On the 6th day of June, dive bombers dispatched from the Enterprise and the Hornet located the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma. Both vessels had inadvertently collided during the chaotic nighttime retreat. The Mikuma was reduced to a sluggish speed of 12 knots. The American dive bombers conducted repeated assaults. The Mikuma sustained hits from 5 bombs and subsequently sank that very afternoon. The Mogami, though severely damaged, managed to survive. This cruiser would necessitate an entire year of extensive repairs. The momentous Battle of Midway had concluded. The ramifications for the strategic landscape were immediate and enduring. Japan had forfeited its strategic ascendancy. Its period of conquest was definitively over. Commencing on the 4th day of June, 1942, Japan was relegated to a defensive posture. The Americans would henceforth dictate the arenas and timing of engagements. The Japanese would be compelled to react, perpetually understaffed and struggling to consolidate their remaining carrier-based air power. 2 months after Midway, American forces commenced their landings on Guadalcanal. This marked the inception of a protracted campaign that would endure for 6 months and further deplete Japan's aerial strength. The carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku were deployed in the engagement surrounding Guadalcanal. Both ships survived the conflict, but their accompanying air groups were utterly devastated. By the conclusion of the Guadalcanal campaign, Japan had sustained the loss of hundreds more pilots and aircraft. The training infrastructure proved incapable of replenishing these losses at the required pace. By the middle of 1943, Japanese carrier air groups were but spectral remnants of their former formidable selves. The decline was relentless. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, Japanese carrier aircraft launched an assault on the American fleet in what American aviators aptly termed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot from the skies in a single day. The pilots who undertook these missions possessed minimal training and scant experience. They flew directly into concentrated anti-aircraft fire and were intercepted by American fighters guided by radar. The resulting slaughter was absolute. By October of 1944, when the Japanese carrier force made its final, futile appearance at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the carriers were effectively hollowed-out shells. They carried a meager number of aircraft and lacked experienced aviators to pilot them. The carriers were repurposed as decoys, sailing northward to draw American attention away, while Japanese battleships attempted to assault the landing beaches. The deception was successful. Admiral William Halsey took the bait and pursued the Japanese carriers northward, but American escort carriers and destroyers effectively halted the Japanese battleships. The decoy carriers were ultimately destroyed by American airstrikes. It was a moot point, however, as they possessed no aircraft to launch. The trajectory from Midway to Japan's eventual defeat was unequivocally clear and unavoidable. Without supremacy in carrier-based air power, Japan could not possibly defend its newly acquired territories. Without these territories, Japan was denied access to the vital resources, particularly oil, that fueled its war-making machinery. The depletion of resources led to a sharp decline in industrial output. The inability to produce necessary material meant the military could not adequately replace its losses. This downward spiral had become irreversible. Lieutenant Commander McClusky's pivotal decision to persist with his search, despite his dwindling fuel reserves, and to follow the wake of the destroyer Arashi, thereby striking at the precise moment of maximum Japanese carrier vulnerability, had initiated this catastrophic cascade. Admiral Nimitz would later attest that McClusky's astute judgment determined the fate of the carrier task force, and, consequently, the forces engaged at Midway. Without that single decision, without the 5 minutes of utter devastation unleashed at precisely 10:24 a.m. on June 4th, the Pacific War might have dragged on for several additional years. The Japanese officers who survived the cataclysm at Midway grasped the magnitude of what had been irrevocably lost. Captain Fuchida would later pen that the battle had sealed Japan's doom. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who commanded the carrier striking force, was subsequently removed from his post and relegated to an obscure assignment. He took his own life in July of 1944 during the battle for Saipan, choosing death over the ignominy of capture. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, who perished with his flagship Hiryu, was widely regarded as one of the most brilliant officers in the Imperial Navy. His demise deprived Japan of a leader who might have salvaged something from the subsequent calamities. For the American aviators who participated in the battle, the triumph was tinged with sorrow. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been utterly annihilated. Only Ensign George Gay survived from its 15 aircrews. Torpedo Squadron 6, flying from the Enterprise, lost 10 of its 14 aircraft. Torpedo Squadron 3, operating from the Yorktown, lost 10 of its 12 planes. The dive bomber squadrons also sustained significant casualties. Of the 115 American aircraft that engaged the Japanese carriers on June 4th, 54 were lost. The price of victory had been steep. Yet, the surviving pilots recognized the extraordinary nature of their achievement. Lieutenant Commander McClusky, who sustained a wound to his shoulder from Japanese fighter fire during his escape, managed to return to the Enterprise with less than 5 gallons of fuel remaining. Some pilots, succumbing to fuel exhaustion, were forced to ditch in the ocean. 10 pilots from McClusky's group were never located. However, the survivors understood the profound significance of their accomplishment. They had annihilated the Japanese carrier striking force. They had irrevocably altered the course of the Pacific War. The impeccable timing of the attack, that crucial 5-minute window when all elements converged, was a confluence of both fortuitous chance and hard-won opportunity. It was fortunate that McClusky spotted the destroyer Arashi. It was fortunate that the Japanese carriers were in the process of turning into the wind to prepare for flight operations at that precisely detrimental moment. It was fortunate that the Japanese combat air patrol had descended to sea level in pursuit of torpedo bombers. But this good fortune was itself earned through McClusky's unwavering decision to continue the search. It was earned through the courageous sacrifice of the torpedo bomber crews who deliberately drew the Japanese fighters lower, through the diligent efforts of the cryptographers who successfully deciphered the Japanese code, and through Admiral Nimitz's strategic placement of his carriers northeast of Midway, guided by this vital intelligence. War correspondent Robert Sherrod would later assert that Midway stood as the most critical engagement of the Pacific War, surpassing in importance Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Midway definitively settled the question of who would command the Pacific. From June 4, 1942, onward, that question was definitively answered. The United States would indeed control the vast expanse of the Pacific. Japan would be condemned to fight a defensive conflict, suffering successive defeats, losing territory island by island, until the devastating atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki compelled their surrender in August of 1945. The far-reaching consequences of those 5 minutes reverberated for years. In July of 1945, as Japan braced for the anticipated American invasion of its home islands, military strategists calculated that they might possibly repel a single landing attempt. However, without the indispensable support of carrier-based air power, without naval superiority, and without the resources necessary to sustain a prolonged defense, defeat was a foregone conclusion. The kamikaze attacks of 1945, the desperate suicide missions that saw pilots and aircraft deliberately sacrificed in a futile effort to sink American warships, were symptomatic of Japan's complete collapse of naval aviation capability. The expertly trained pilots were no more, having perished at Midway and in the ensuing battles. Their replacements, a cadre of desperate, minimally trained aviators, could do little more than crash their planes into enemy vessels. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Midway operation, never truly recovered from the profound defeat. He continued to command the combined fleet, but his health deteriorated. He became increasingly resigned to fate. In April of 1943, American cryptographers intercepted a communication detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour of forward bases. Admiral Nimitz authorized an assassination mission, which was executed on April 18, 1943. American P-38 fighters intercepted Yamamoto's transport aircraft over Bougainville and shot it down. The mastermind behind the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and the strategic gamble at Midway was now dead. His demise was a direct consequence of American code-breaking prowess, the very same intelligence advantage that had paved the way for victory at Midway. The 5 minutes that commenced at 10:24 a.m. on June 4, 1942, unequivocally demonstrated a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Industrial capacity ultimately supersedes fighting spirit. Intelligence triumphs over mere operational planning. The side capable of replacing losses more rapidly will ultimately prevail. The side that can decipher the enemy's intentions holds a decisive advantage. The side that can effectively coordinate disparate forces, even when circumstances devolve into chaos, will emerge victorious. Japan entered World War II with the conviction that superior training, an indomitable fighting spirit, and flawless operational execution would overcome America's overwhelming industrial might. Midway irrevocably disproved this deeply held belief. American aviators, many of whom were fresh from their training and piloting somewhat antiquated TBD torpedo bombers, had perished while attacking Japanese carriers. Their sacrifice, while not directly annihilating the enemy carriers, had strategically drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, thereby creating the optimal conditions for the dive bombers to achieve their devastating success. The American system functioned effectively, even when individual components faltered. The Japanese system, despite its renowned excellence in training and its unwavering fighting spirit, proved incapable of adaptation. When the carriers were struck, when fires erupted, when the commanding admiral was forced to abandon his flagship, the entire command structure imploded. There was no redundancy, no depth to fall back upon. The carriers were lost not solely to American ordnance, but to inherent design flaws. Aviation fuel lines were exposed and ran precariously across the hangar decks. Ammunition, including bombs and torpedoes, was stored without adequate protective measures. Damage control systems were demonstrably insufficient. The carriers, while capable of launching devastating aerial assaults, lacked the resilience to withstand significant damage. This stark contrast extended to strategic planning. Admiral Yamamoto's elaborate plan for Midway was a complex orchestration, involving multiple forces attacking in carefully sequenced waves, augmented by diversions and feints designed to bewilder the Americans. However, complexity inevitably breeds vulnerability. When the Americans, through their successful code-breaking efforts, gained foreknowledge of the Japanese plans, this very complexity worked to Japan's detriment. Forces were dispersed, rendering them less effective. The battleships were positioned too far afield to provide timely support to the carriers. The invasion force was similarly unable to offer crucial assistance to the carriers. The diversionary attack on the Aleutians drew away assets that might have proven decisive at Midway. American planning, in contrast, was remarkably straightforward. Admiral Nimitz strategically positioned his carriers northeast of Midway, patiently awaiting the Japanese offensive. He then unleashed his entire available force. While the American attacks were not perfectly coordinated, with squadrons arriving piecemeal, sufficient strikes succeeded to achieve the catastrophic destruction of the Japanese carriers. Simple planning, executed with imperfect coordination, proved far more effective than complex planning that demanded flawless execution at every stage. The lessons learned at Midway would profoundly shape the future of naval warfare throughout the remainder of the 20th century. Aircraft carriers would ascend to become the dominant capital ships of naval fleets. Battleships, despite their formidable armor and firepower, were rendered largely obsolete. The carrier, capable of projecting air power from hundreds of miles away, would henceforth dictate control of the seas. The nation that could construct carriers at a pace exceeding their attrition rate would inevitably triumph in naval conflicts. The United States commissioned 115 carriers during World War II. Japan, in stark contrast, built only 25. This overwhelming disparity in production capacity was the ultimate deciding factor in the Pacific War. The dive bomber pilots who attacked the Japanese carriers on June 4, 1942, could not have possibly comprehended that they were participating in a pivotal turning point of human history. Their immediate focus was singular: to accurately strike their targets, to evade the deadly anti-aircraft fire, and to successfully return to their own carriers. Lieutenant Commander McClusky himself, despite his wounds, returned to the Enterprise with his aircraft riddled with bullet holes, a painful shoulder injury, and a critically low fuel gauge, questioning whether he possessed enough remaining fuel to reach friendly shores. Lieutenant Richard Best, who had aborted his dive on the Kaga to target a different vessel, now found himself evading pursuing Japanese fighters. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, who led the Yorktown dive bombers against the Soryu, was deeply concerned about the aircraft he had lost during the engagement. However, historians would later acknowledge that these men, through their actions within a mere 5 minutes of combat, accomplished what armies striving for years could not. They had fundamentally shattered the backbone of Japanese naval power. They had decisively shifted the momentum of the Pacific War. They had created the essential conditions for ultimate Allied victory. Admiral Nimitz would later reflect that the war might have protracted for an additional 3 years had the victory at Midway not been achieved. 3 more years of relentless combat, 3 more years of devastating losses, 3 more years of immeasurable suffering. The Japanese pilots who perished in the infernos aboard the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were as exceptionally skilled and devoted as any aviators in history. They had undergone years of rigorous training and possessed combat experience that few could match. They had executed flawless attacks at Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and elsewhere. Yet, on June 4, 1942, they were caught on the flight decks of their carriers, rendered incapable of launching, unable to defend themselves, and ultimately, unable to survive. Their formidable skill and unwavering dedication proved insufficient to shield them from American bombs impacting their vessels at the most critical and vulnerable moment. Commander Fuchida, who survived Midway despite sustaining broken ankles, spent the remainder of the war in a staff capacity. He would later author the definitive Japanese account of the battle, published in 1955 as Midway, the battle that doomed Japan. In his authoritative work, Fuchida readily acknowledged the complete element of surprise achieved by the Americans, conceding that the Japanese carriers were caught at their absolute weakest point and that the battle had irrevocably determined Japan's fate. He graciously credited American intelligence for their success in breaking Japanese codes, American pilots for their relentless pursuit of their attacks despite experiencing devastating losses, and American leadership for their strategic deployment of forces. The fateful 5 minutes that extinguished Japan's opportunity for victory commenced at 10:24 a.m. and concluded at 10:29 a.m. Within this brief span, 3 aircraft carriers sustained fatal damage. In the hours that followed, all 3 would tragically sink. By the close of that day, all 4 Japanese carriers that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor were lost. The formidable striking force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 preceding months was utterly annihilated. Lieutenant Commander McClusky returned to the Enterprise with 52 bullet holes peppering his aircraft, a painful wound to his shoulder, and a fuel reserve that was virtually non-existent. He had executed the single most consequential tactical decision of the entire Pacific War. His choice to persevere with the search, to follow the destroyer's discernible wake, and to attack when the opportune moment presented itself, had fundamentally altered the course of history. He was awarded the Navy Cross for his extraordinary actions. However, he consistently eschewed any claims of heroism, stating he was merely fulfilling his duty. This characteristic modesty defined the American response to Midway. The pilots who survived did not boast of their monumental achievement. Instead, they mourned the comrades who would not return. They diligently prepared for the subsequent battles ahead. They understood that Midway represented but one crucial victory in a protracted war, yet it was the victory that rendered all subsequent American triumphs possible. The 5 minutes that commenced at 10:24 a.m. on June 4, 1942, unequivocally demonstrated that wars are ultimately decided not by singular, isolated battles, but by the relentless accumulation of strategic advantages. This includes an intelligence advantage, an industrial advantage, a training advantage, and a technological advantage. The side possessing a greater number of compounding advantages over time will inevitably emerge victorious. Japan possessed a significant advantage in training and tactical prowess. America, however, possessed all the other crucial elements. Those 5 minutes brutally illuminated this disparity. From that moment forward, Japan was compelled to fight a defensive war it could not possibly win. The vast empire that had conquered half of Asia and the Pacific within a mere 6 months would spend the subsequent 3 years systematically losing every inch of territory it had gained. The prodigious industrial might that America unleashed, its seemingly inexhaustible resources, its capacity to replace carriers, aircraft, and pilots with remarkable speed, would steadily grind down Japanese resistance until nothing remained but the devastating impact of atomic bombs and the finality of surrender. The 5 minutes that shattered Japan's prospects for victory were unequivocally the most consequential 5 minutes of the entire Pacific War. They served as the critical hinge upon which the entire conflict irrevocably turned. Prior to 10:24 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Japan still possessed a chance, however slender, to negotiate a favorable peace settlement. Following the conclusion of those 5 minutes at 10:29 a.m., that possibility had vanished entirely. All that transpired subsequently was merely the working out of that foregone and inevitable conclusion. The devastating bombs that rained down upon the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu within those 5 minutes not only decided the outcome of the Battle of Midway, but also determined the ultimate fate of the Pacific War. This outcome was not a product of American superiority in sheer courage or fighting spirit. The Japanese pilots who perished within the searing flames were as brave as any warriors throughout history. Rather, this victory was the direct result of superior intelligence, meticulous preparation, immense industrial capacity, and the strategic accumulation of numerous small advantages. These included the code breakers who deciphered Japanese communications, the dedicated shipyard workers who miraculously repaired the Yorktown in just 72 hours, the torpedo bomber crews whose courageous sacrifice drew Japanese fighters to lower altitudes, and the fortuitous positioning of a destroyer steaming northeast at precisely the opportune moment to guide McClusky to his critical target. All these intertwined factors converged to create 5 minutes that fundamentally altered the course of global events. When Lieutenant Commander McClusky was later questioned about his decision to continue the search, he simply stated he had no alternative. His orders were explicit: to locate and destroy the Japanese carriers. He found them and he destroyed them. That, he maintained, was his duty. The fact that his judgment during those critical moments, when fuel was dangerously low and the vast ocean seemed devoid of hope, ultimately decided the fate of nations was, in his view, simply an inherent aspect of warfare. Sometimes, individual decisions possess a magnitude far exceeding any initial prediction. Sometimes, 5 minutes can carry more weight than 5 years. Occasionally, a single pilot's choice to turn north instead of south can irrevocably alter the trajectory of history. The Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned ferociously for hours before finally succumbing to the sea. The infernos, ignited at 10:24 a.m., proved impossible to contain. The volatile aviation fuel, the vast quantities of ordnance stored throughout the vessels, and the torpedoes continued to detonate. Bulkheads buckled and collapsed under the intense heat and explosive force. Decks warped and buckled. Men trapped below decks perished in the searing flames or drowned when compartments became inundated with seawater. The ships that had appeared utterly invincible in December of 1941 were gone by the dawn of June 5, 1942. 5 minutes, 300 seconds, the time it takes to brew a cup of coffee. the time it takes to traverse the length of a city block, the time it takes to irrevocably change the world. At 10:24 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Japan still harbored a viable chance. By 10:29 a.m., that chance had been utterly extinguished, consumed by the raging infernos aboard 3 aircraft carriers adrift in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean.